heats up. China won't win. The US and Taiwan deploy thousands of military and missiles. The world has now endured upheaval by a pandemic for a full year, and the aftershocks will continue long after most people finally receive the vaccine to COVID-19. Thus, you may say, this is no time to frighten the horses by highlighting another peril. However, just as nothing says that if tragedy strikes a family once, it cannot do so again, ask the Kennedys, so fate can be mean on mercy, when it comes to epical threats. The Council for Foreign Relations has published a new report by two respected public servants, which urges the imminence of the risk of conflict between China and US over Taiwan. That territory, 90 miles off China's coast and inhabited by 24 million people, is not a nation, but for decades has been an unofficial American protectorate. During 2020, write Robert D. Blackwell and Philip Zelikow, we came to believe that a crisis was building over Taiwan and that it was becoming the most dangerous flashpoint in the world for a possible war that involved the US, China and probably other major powers. The horrendous global consequences should preoccupy the Biden team, beginning with the president. The White House seems to agree. President Joe Biden held a virtual meeting with the leaders of Australia, India and Japan, the first summit of the so-called Quad since 2017. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin are about to visit Japan and South Korea. Next week in Alaska, Blinken will have the administration's first face-to-face talks with the Chinese. Meanwhile, on Wednesday, an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer conducted one of the U.S. Navy's routine exercises to reassert its right of passage through the Taiwan Strait. The new analysis from Blackwell, who has held a bevy of high government positions including Deputy National Security Advisor to President George W. Bush, and Zelikow, the Executive Director of the 9/11 Commission, comes none too late. Taiwan, they write, is one of the most successful societies on Earth. Yet few Americans likely understand why the US would risk war with China to protect it. No matter that it might be possible to prevent such a showdown from going nuclear, or even from becoming a general conflict, the economic fallout would be horrendous. A clash between China and the West would almost certainly provoke cyber attacks, even if nobody fires guns. A major cyber attack on the US financial system could cost 2.5 times daily gross domestic product, according to the New York Federal Reserve. A cyber-induced blackout affecting just 15 US states might cost up to $1 trillion in damage, not to mention many deaths resulting from disruption to healthcare, traffic and industry, suggests a projection by Cambridge University and Lloyd's. Coincidentally, just before the Council's study was published, I received an email from an Australian strategy guru who asked, "How do you rate the chances of getting through this decade without a Taiwan crisis?" He himself thought, "Poor." A few years ago, during a period in which I frequently visited China, I was struck by how often ordinary Chinese raised the Taiwan issue. Their concern reflected years of state propagandizing. Westerners should understand that when President Xi Jinping rattles sabers, as he does with increasing frequency, he commands genuine popular support. Taiwan evokes the sort of sentiment among his people that Cuba did among Americans 60 years ago, and look where that story nearly ended. Xi said 2 years ago that China would do its utmost to achieve peaceful reunification. However, he added, "We do not renounce the use of force and reserve the option of taking all necessary measures." Blackwell and Zelikow take him at his word. China is now in a pre-war tempo of political and military preparations. We do not mean that we know that China is about to embark on a war. We simply observe that the Chinese government is taking actions that a country would do if it were moving into a pre-war mode. Politically, it is preparing and conditioning its population for the possibility of an armed conflict. Xi may not yet have decided whether to trigger drastic action towards Taiwan. But China's aggressive behavior in the South China Sea, and in disputes with India and Japan, shows a high tolerance for risk. There are legitimate fears that China will seek to exploit perceived Western weakness and disarray to foreclose the Taiwan dispute on its own terms. After 4 years of name-calling by President Donald Trump, the Biden administration needs a considered strategy toward Beijing, which America's allies have long called for. For more than 4 decades, the U.S. has sustained a policy of strategic ambiguity about Taiwan. Washington hasn't provoked Beijing by challenging the One China principle accepted by President Richard Nixon half a century ago. Even Trump, speaking in August 2020, declined. For more than 4 decades, the U.S. has sustained a policy of strategic ambiguity about Taiwan. Washington hasn't provoked Beijing by challenging the One China principle accepted by President Richard Nixon half a century ago. Even Trump, speaking in August 2020, declined explicitly to commit U.S. forces to defend the island if it was attacked, saying only, "China knows what I'm going to do." In perhaps the most important passage of the Council on Foreign Relations report, the authors caution against an explicit U.S. pledge to commit its own forces in the event of a Chinese invasion. Instead, they urge assistance for the Taiwanese to strengthen their own defenses, which are run down. Taipei's current capabilities do not offer a credible deterrent to a surprise assault from the mainland. Among other things, such assistance would include supplying a network of sensors and missiles capable of providing a tripwire, time-buying defense, similar to what the West prepared for Berlin in the Cold War. Many in the Taipei leadership assume they can rely on a swift and overwhelming U.S. military response to Chinese aggression. Yet a former chief of staff of the island's military, Admiral Li Shiming, has correctly challenged this strategy, saying, "All I can hear is that the United States will intervene. What reason is there to believe that the United States will sacrifice the lives of its own children to defend Taiwan? My best bet is my own strength, to stop people from bullying me." It is a recurring weakness of U.S. foreign policy to determine courses for other nations, often with little or no consultation with allies. Through 2 decades of decision-making in Indochina, for instance, no Vietnamese leader was invited to the key Washington meetings. The Council on Foreign Relations study argues that Taiwan's independence can be protected only by a diplomatic and military strategy that has commitments from Australia, South Korea and, above all, Japan. The Australians need no awakening. They are suffering diplomatic abuse and Chinese harassment following their fierce criticism of Beijing's recent behavior. The Japanese are moving slowly away from their post-World War II rejection of rearmament. They recognize a need to be capable of confronting, or at least deterring, Chinese naval and military initiatives, not least against the disputed Senkaku Islands. Blackwell and Zelikow write, "We believe Japan would regard a violent Chinese takeover of Taiwan as a threat to the vital interests of Japan, even to its future independence and existence." It seems significant and welcome that Biden's first important foreign visitor to the White House is reportedly to be Japan's Prime Minister, Yoshihide Suga. It will be surprising if Taiwan is not prominent on the agenda for their meeting, which may take place next month.